and welcome to episode 60 of the Relationship Restaurant. We are Poppy and Jeff Spencer. Delighted to have you with us today. We have a very special guest, our mentor that Poppy is going to introduce.
This is great. I love Coach Dave, as I call him. It's Dr. Dave Kruger, who is an executive mentor coach, CEO of Mentor Path, an executive coaching, training, publishing, and wellness firm. And Dave's work integrates psychology and neuroscience, one of my favorite topics, with strategic coaching to help execs and professionals write the next chapter of their life or their business. And he has already published 23 trade and professional books on success, wellness, money, self-development, and get the 75 scientific papers. His book, The Secret Language of Money, which we both read, is published from McGraw-Hill, is a business bestseller, translated into 10 languages, and he has 2 new books this year. The first one is Engaging the Ineffable Toward Mindfulness and Meaning, and that's by Paragon House. And his recent one, which just came out last month, and which, if you listen long enough, you'll have a chance to get a little gift here, Your New Money Story. It's the beliefs, behaviors, and brain science to rewire for wealth. And that's by Roman and Littlefield of New York and London. So Dave was my mentor coach many, many years ago, probably 12 years ago. He's the Dean of Curriculum for Coach Training Alliance. He's been quoted in Money, Fortune, Forbes, Town & Country, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and was elected to the American Society of Journalists and Authors. He's the founder and director of his own licensed specialty certified New Life Story Wellness Coaching, of which Jeff and I are graduates, and also the New Money Story Mentor Training. He has trained professionals worldwide, develops internal mentor programs for corporations. Dr. Kruger formerly practiced and taught psychiatry and psychoanalysis and was clinical professor of psychiatry. He's listed in the Best Doctors in America annually for 7 years and was listed in America's Top Psychiatrists, and that was from the Consumer Research Council of America in Washington, D.C. He founded and served as CEO for 2 healthcare corporations, co-founded a 3rd startup that went from venture capital to merger acquisition, and founded Houston Gathering of Angel Investment Group. We are so delighted and thrilled and honored to have Dr. Dave Kruger join us. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you, Poppy and Jeff. It's a privilege to be here and always fun to talk with you guys.
You know, one of the things that I've always admired about you, and it really is a great part of your story of understanding your wealth of background, Dave. You've been on both sides of the equation of helping people, both as a professional doctor, a psychiatrist, and also making the transition to the non-medical field of coaching, as Poppy and I are in. And so it's great that you can look at it from both sides of the coin here and cross over between these 2 worlds, because people often look at these things as 2 very separate items. Therapy is one thing, coaching is another. And I know you have a great little expression. You talk about a difference of coaching and therapy that we quote very often.
Yes, and we give you credit each time. Dave, do you want to share that? The analogy that you use about coaching versus therapy?
I'm not quite sure what.
Which one?
Which one?
You've talked about like therapy is kind of similar to an archaeologist.
Okay.
And working with a coach is like working with an architect.
Building something.
Yeah. You know, I didn't think I could have any more fun doing the work I did in therapy and analysis with the people I was privileged to work with, but I continued with my plan to do an early retirement at 25 years and then make a wholesale transition about a dozen years ago to mentor coaching, and I've had even more fun. It's even more creatively exciting, and I get to tell more stories. I don't have to be so quiet behind the couch. I mean, it's just terrific.
No, it's great. Well, today we're going to be talking about the art and neuroscience of relationships. And we couldn't have a better guest to join us today. So you're all in for a real treat. So sit back and enjoy. Hopefully you'll gain something new. So
the first topic we want to kind of get into with you, Dave, is what about talking about what happens in the brain when at the beginning of a conflict between a couple of people, and during and after the conflict is successfully resolved, what happens in the brain?
Okay, that's a great start. We talk about conflict more in therapy and analysis, and in coaching. A more useful term, a way to talk about this, is to think about how we all have a surface and a shadow story. Our surface story is what we know, what we consciously and logically are aware of. It's about planning and intellect, but that only is about 5 to 10% of our operating system. More than 90% of our operating system is unconscious, but yet it directs and ghostwrites the stories that we create individually and collectively in a relationship. So if the shadow story, for example, that may or may not even be conscious, goes in the opposite direction of a surface story, then someone ends up being stuck. A surface story may be, well, I'd like to generate more income and create wealth. But the shadow story, whether or not it's conscious, can go in the opposite direction. I don't think I have what it takes, or making a lot of money is unspiritual, or what if I try my best and I fail and then I'll be embarrassed, so I'd better stick with what I have. So these stories need to be as much in awareness as possible. And a simple example of how in a couple relationship, one partner's brain can be wired that money equals freedom. So spending is the most enjoyable thing. The other partner's brain is wired for money to be security. So saving is what meets needs and ideals. So they have to come together, create a common ground, and look at how they're going to collaborate to create a new story together.
Got it. So we have, every human being then has this surface and shadow dichotomy, if you will, going on all the time.
Yes, exactly.
And then it's up to us to take the time to pause, to become aware of that and recognize that that is the phenomenon that's occurring.
Exactly. And the best way to really come to be aware of a story or to change a habit is not to look at the goal, because that's in the future and that's abstract, but to look at the system. How do you create a system to go through stepwise changes in order to get to where you want to go? For example, the most common cause of someone resisting doing something new or different or improved is not that they're innately resistant, but that they simply may not know what the next step is.
Right.
So it's a matter of creating a system, a series of steps, so that you can ultimately get to the goal. And you guys have heard me tell this story. I think this illustrates the point here. Terry Fox ran the Marathon of Hope. It's a cross-country run in Canada of 3,339 miles. He was challenged because he had an artificial leg, but he managed to average 24 miles a day and completed the race in 147 days. He was interviewed immediately after the race and asked, how in the world, with you being exhausted, did you manage to keep going those thousands of miles? He said, I just ran to the next telephone pole. And
wow.
that's making the change one step at a time. Now he knew where the telephone
right.
ended. He had the goal in mind, but all he focused on was the next best thing. And that's the way our minds and brains work. We get what we focus on, not what we want, because focus aligns the energy field of the brain. So that's part of, as you know, what we do as mentor coaches is to help someone with this process so they can internalize a model so that ultimately they won't need us.
So it's also like, I've heard the expression, eating an elephant one bite at a time.
Exactly. One
well,
bite, next telephone pole.
Yep.
And I know certainly from Jack Canfield, another coach that we had the pleasure of working with and knowing, and law of attraction, that, you know, if you were going to take a trip across country at night and you didn't like, well, I don't know how I can do this at night because I can't see where the end city or the location is that I'm going to, but my headlights will flash 200 yards ahead, and as long as I can see 200 yards, I'll be okay. I know that there's 200 yards that I know where I'm going. I think that was kind of
Yeah.
the example. So I really like that. So let's say a couple is in conflict. Let's just say for the sake of it, we can even talk about money. Let's say they're arguing about money, and one spouse, the woman, is wanting to have financial security, and the man is wanting that freedom that you talked about. So how can they resolve? What would they do if they could have this awareness of the surface and the shadow? How could they get through this conversation in a productive and healthy way?
Okay, a great question. One thing to think of initially is, how do you frame a conversation? How do you begin a conversation? A common perception is that the best way to get employees or players or a partner to perform or do something is by pointing out mistakes or threats or being intense. And negative emotions grab attention, but a positive focus works considerably better to develop loyalty and bonding and personal connection. This is what we know from neuroscience. The first few words of a conversation boots up a particular mindset that then processes the remainder of the conversation in the listener or the reader. For example, if the first few words are ones that are perceived as judgmental or critical or negative or simply just factual, it boots up a mindset that is mediated by cortisol and adrenaline, that trust and listening carefully and perhaps defensively is the mindset that processes the remainder of the conversation. So somebody's partly an observer and partly participating, which affects the entire conversation. Consider the opposite. When the first few words of a conversation are engaging and collaborative, that boots up a mindset that's mediated by oxytocin, the chemical of bonding and connection. And together, then, two people move in a way that begins with this common ground. So everything that follows will be different. So it's that important in terms of beginning to establish a collaborative relationship. Now, think about a contrasting issue here. Think about how in coaching, one of the hallmarks of coaching is that we engage in a collaborative relationship with our clients so that we can help them develop their stories, not ghostwrite it for them, but to be a catalyst for them to develop it. Now, consider any other professional and the model that they use. Docs, dentists, attorneys, financial professionals, they have a consultative relationship, but they began by looking at problems and then offer a professional opinion, which is what they're paid to do, to tell somebody what they need to do to solve problems. Well, here's an illustration of how that works. Of people who consult physicians, and the physician has, as part of that professional recommendation, a prescription. Less than 50% of people actually fill that prescription. Those who fill it, less than 50% of them actually take it as directed. So when somebody consults an expert and they're scared and they have to go through the hassle of getting in the car and schlepping across town and parking, waiting, and being exposed to all the stuff in the waiting room, less than 1 in 4 actually do as directed. So that model really doesn't work that well. Another more extreme model of people in the coronary care unit, the intensive care unit, who have just had a massive heart attack. They are told unequivocally and given ample information that unless they change their lifestyle and their nutrition, that they have a very limited life expectancy. Guess how many people change on the basis of that?
Right.
I mean, I guess a small percentage, yeah.
Yeah, 1 of 9.
1 of 9.
So basically, information doesn't work. In fact, and this is useful with working with couples as well. In fact, I have a blog that will explain it more than we have time. But I posted a blog 2 days ago on my website, mentorpath.com, under the tab blog, about the boomerang effect, because facts and logic are not powerful tools to alter opinions. Our minds don't follow the facts, but they follow our beliefs and our identities. In fact, and this is really important for couples to think about, information can actually backfire. We regard information as valid evidence when it reinforces our already existing views.
Right.
And this is how arguments can more staunchly solidify each partner's original position. Presenting somebody with information that contradicts what their existing opinion is often causes that person to generate new counter arguments to further strengthen their view. This is the boomerang effect.
Right.
It results in greater entrenchment in an original position and even polarizes that position. In fact, a couple of recent studies have shown that the more intelligent people are, the greater their ability to creatively rationalize and interpret information to fit their opinions.
Their existing schema, yes.
Furthers it even more.
And even if it's not logical or practical or whatever, they're going to dig their feet in further. Right?
Yeah, Dave, we were just Poppy and I've been taking a course on conflict resolution. Well, one of the things that an acronym that I've really enjoyed studying, we actually did a podcast on this too, is the acronym TRIP, is that people don't typically argue really about the topic. Most of the argument becomes entrenched in what their relationship is, and also they're just worried much more about their identity and saving face. And that's exactly what you're talking about here, is they'll dig in and just battle their position because they're just trying to save face. The topic itself has almost become irrelevant.
Exactly. If you look at that really closely and deconstruct what you just said, for each person in that engagement, there's usually some emotional trigger that will instantly create a state change, and they enter a time capsule, and they're saying the same things, having the same arguments, making the same position statements that they've always made. So it comes to be about something other than what they intended initially. And
right.
They enter each their own time capsules, and it gets into that stuck position and the upset, because whatever started it will cue a reaction to create a state change. And you said something also really important, and as you know from coaching, the most powerful force of the human psyche is our identity. So whatever we do and whatever we change, whatever new behavior we have, unless we incorporate that as part of our operating model of who we are, our identity, we're going to revert back to that identity. So it's really important to give an understanding and importance to evolving who we are and our identity. For example, if you, I correspond with a couple of neuroeconomics labs. If you hook people up to an fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, and put 10 items in front of them and follow and track the brain response, with greater than 95% prediction power, you can predict which one of those 10 things the person will buy. And this is what we know in neuromarketing now. They buy what they identify with.
Yes.
That's the importance of acknowledging this and thinking about it as we're helping people come to look at themselves and their relationship and to plan new things together.
So let's just jump forward a little bit. What are some things that neuroscience can teach us about better communication with our partner? For instance, we have said in our coaching practice, when we work with couples or individuals, that people are genuinely reticent and afraid to approach a topic that they know has caused conflict in the past. And so we sometimes suggest to put your worst fear out there, and also include that collaborative statement that you suggested earlier of saying something like, I'm not really sure how to say this, and I'm kind of afraid that you won't understand what I'm about to say, and I really would love your help in this. Can you help me brainstorm and get my words out so that they come out in a way that we both will have clarity? Something like that. Is that a good opening statement where the other person would be receptive to being collaborative and helpful?
Yes, I think the principle is really important. And here's what we know from neuroscience about exactly what you're talking about. That, as I mentioned, the initial few words, and especially if they're collaborative, will establish that framework. So what some studies have shown is that asking for problems creates a mindset of problems in the recipient. This was done in corporations. While asking about success created a mindset of success. So the act of asking positive questions affects individuals and organizations positively. If you ask negative questions or have a problem focus, it's going to boot up a whole mindset that will be searching then for problems, because we move toward the images we create or remember in our brains. And the power of positive framing and asking generative questions are essentially important in a collaborative effort like this. So you want to ask about what you want more of rather than about problems and barriers. So perhaps beginning with all the things that are positive about the relationship, all the good stuff, because it's easier to go to then addressing some things that are challenges than beginning with problems or beginning with one person's point of view, because the partner very well knows the other person's point of view. They can finish the sentence. They know exactly what the partner thinks and feels. And when it's done in this way collaboratively, here's the key. People will commit to what they help create.
Yes.
This is the intended outcome and mindset of positive communication and of collaboration.
I really like that. For instance, when we've seen things like said, would you donate to, I think they've done neuromarketing on this as well. Would you donate to underserved people in a third world country and send a check in whatever amount to this third world country versus here is little Anna. She is 5 years old. She's undernourished. She has this is her story. This is her parents' story and their struggle. I'm much more apt to contribute to Anna and her family than just a big country check that I'm going to send.
It has that specificity. There was an extensive study set up exactly as you described. And then here's a picture of Roika, a 7-year-old who obviously was malnourished, and it enhanced donations almost fourfold.
Of course, because we have that picture. So in a relationship, in a love relationship that we're talking about, how do we re-engage or reboot that commitment if one or both partners is feeling shut down or not listened to, not heard? How can we re-tap that person to engage with us and get that commitment that you just talked about?
One thing, a couple of aspects. One is to begin at the end and work backwards, to have each present a vision of how they would like it to be, because we continually, our brains tend to focus and move toward what we envision. So looking at where someone wants to end up can be very beneficial. And then to look in the beginning, instead of looking at problems, because you'll find problems, but when you look for solutions, a positive framework offers then some generative questions about how to get there. So be clear about what you want more of and focus on that rather than focusing on the problems, because often the problems will fairly quickly boot up that emotional trigger, and somebody's going to be, each will be in their own time capsule and they're stuck just like before.
Okay, so for example, a couple will come to us and they'll say, my partner stonewalls or my partner shuts down when I bring up a conversation. So you're suggesting that the person that initiates the communication should say, do they have to go back in time to a time when they were happy, in the time when they were connected and having this deep, meaningful feeling relationship? How would that work? How does that work?
one possibility there would be, instead of focusing on the problem, to look at the last time they had a conversation that resulted in a positive and collaborative effort, so that they look at their success. Instead of beginning with a problem, they began with a success, and that's a way of being clear about what we want more of and focus on that.
Okay, good. So in this example, I could say to, if this were me and Jeff, I'm just going to use an example of like, oh my gosh, you were a rock star. You helped me so much when we were working with, a crisis that we had with, an aging parent. And you stepped in and you did something that I couldn't do. And I don't know what I would do without you. You were wonderful, something like that. And then how would we segue to a need, but my goal is to communicate more deeply or more effectively or productively. If that's my goal, how do I broach that with my partner?
Okay, first of all, two things. One is about the process and the other is the focus. What we know now from a number of neuroscience studies is that we actually attend to comprehend and remember up to 10 words at a time.
Right.
A colleague of mine at Loyola Marymount MBA program did some research in this in emotionally charged situations like divorce, mediation, various things. And he had people who agreed to do this studies with him put up both fists, and each time they used a word, they would put up one digit, and when they got to 10, they had to stop. And then the other side had an equal up to 10 words. When they did this, they found resolution in 20 to 30% of the time and a much more satisfactory resolution. So from our side, as mentor coaches, I would say keep it the 4 rules of good writing, speaking are clarity, brevity, simplicity, humanity. Because sometimes when partners get in conversations, they lose each other because they get into the second and the third paragraph and the other one's planning what they're going to have for dinner that night. So we have to lead the way in clarity, brevity, and specificity in what we ask. Then, if in this situation you just described, to ask, what was the last time you had a situation like this or a disagreement that you successfully resolved? And just in a sentence or two, could you describe what you did? Not the content of that necessarily, but what you did to come together and resolve it. And then when you have a principle that you can derive from that, that's the positive that you want to bring forward to this current situation. So what that does is move a conversation from a depreciative dimension and, looking at something negative and problems to an appreciative question or framework so that each appreciate the other and bring that mindset to apply to this current situation. And the mindset determines what we take in, how we attach meaning, and what we do. So a mindset is huge to begin.
I love this. I'm writing copious notes as you're saying this. And what we take in, it's really, excuse me, it's really interesting how it sounds so simple to say, well, of course we work from a mindset of appreciation, but we don't. As human beings, we generally don't have that. We don't bring that awareness in the initial approach.
It's so much easier to focus on the content, like money. Money's a Rorschach, but it's something tangible and concrete, and it's a portal to the immaterial, all the things that we don't actually know about, all that murky stuff from the more than 90% of our operating system that's unconscious. It needs some kind of anchor in the present that's logical and conscious and specific. Problems are that. If I were to ask you, I didn't set this up right, but let me ask, wipe the slate clean, all of your listeners, and think about this. What is the most common addiction that we have in North America, the most common addiction for all peoples. It's problems, because we always go back to them. We come back to them because we know exactly what to talk about. It's tangible, it's specific. Talking about them is a kind of release. It doesn't resolve anything. It works for a little while, but not well enough for long enough. But an addiction is when a behavior becomes a central organizing factor in your life.
Yes.
And people, as you know, and Jack talks about, they go to the meeting of the Ain't It Awful Club. So it's easy to talk about problems because that's tangible and specific. The other things that are less tangible and that we don't have as much familiarity with are ones that we not so consciously move away from. And that's why the content of that altered state, if there's an emotional trigger, the content of that altered state for the individual is the same conversation, the negative self-talk, the wondering if they can do it. And if it's in a couple's relationship, it's the finger pointing at the other person for blame and fault and problem that the other person creates. The content will never change, but it's so easy to focus on the content because that seems like what ought to change and what we ought to be able to get the other person to change.
Isn't some of this rooted in our evolution, though, that our brain is wired for fear and threats, and the saber-toothed tiger of the caveman, and they were looking for problems and threats for physical survival. So we bring that same brain into our world for emotional survival, and yet you're saying we shouldn't do that. Isn't that about right? I'm just sort of...
Well, that's a great question and point. Let's look at it in a specific way, a way that both of you and I look at it in terms of mentor coaching and what we know that can be helpful. There are two fundamental motivators in our human psyche. These are hardwired in our brain and in the software support of our mind to seek pleasure and to avoid pain. So whatever we do is how we imagine we're going to feel when we do it. But let's say someone gets to a point of having a plan, and then at the moment they would trigger that plan, they say to themselves, no, I'm not going to do it. Or they just stop themselves. And that's frustrating for everybody around them and them. But let's look at that instant very closely from two perspectives. One is, when I work with a client, I will first be sure that the person has a plan, because all you need is a plan and to stick with it. You don't need to be motivated. If they have a plan and they tell themselves, no, I'm not going to do it, at that nanosecond, I think it's helpful for both of us to look at what their internal conversation is.
Mm-hmm.
Do they say to themselves, I'm just not going to do it? Do they defy their own authority? Do they bargain with themselves to say, well, I'm not going to do it now, but I'm really going to get after it next Tuesday? Or do they get to the point and then get a little overwhelmed and feel like, I don't know what the next step is, or get disorganized a bit? So that's important about that dynamic right there. But when they stop themselves, often it gets waylaid by looking at it as sabotage.
Right.
Instead of, there is a moment that someone says no because their shadow story is ghostwriting their behavior. And that over 90% of the shadow story is going to have the bigger vote. So
yes,
if someone has a shadow story that I really won't be able to do it, or I'm going to avoid embarrassment, or whatever the shadow story is, they stop themselves to avoid pain.
right.
So that's important to recognize that they're not actively sabotaging themselves, trying to do themselves in. They are responding, as you mentioned, in an evolutionary way to something that they see at some level as painful, and they're simply protecting themselves. So
yes.
one question then, or two questions at that point, once you recognize this process: what's the greater pain if you don't proceed?
Right.
And what's the greater pleasure if you do proceed? And those are coaching questions. This
Right.
is a way from a coaching perspective, in a here and now way, to deal with choice architecture rather than going back into the past as therapy might and looking at the dynamics and understanding the feelings and reworking and creating a better solution for an old problem. This is more effective, efficient, and direct in terms of looking at this particular dynamic. And this is where an understanding of the mind and brain sciences can be very, very useful, as you know, as you both know.
So in a couples conversation, I mean, we've worked with people where one of the partners doesn't have a high level of self-worth, but the partner can see the potential, can see the value, can see that. And even though they try and they praise and they give that, it's just, it falls into this like empty well. So what can you say to that couple to help the person with the low self-esteem or the low self-worth, rise up? And would you say that same thing? What's the worst that can happen? What's the best? Or, I mean, what would you say to that person?
Okay, that's a good question and a challenging one. One way to think about it is to look at the individual dynamics of self-worth. Self-esteem only comes from one place, or it wouldn't have its first name, self.
Yes.
Self-esteem comes from having an ideal internally that's achievable and living up to it. That's the only place that self-esteem comes from. Nobody can provide it. Nobody can fill you up. Nobody can help you out or give it to you or be it. It's just further affirmation that, well, they see, I'm not worth anything either, and they're just trying to, lop some on top. So individually then, both of them, if you're working with them together, might be to look at what their individual ideals are and how they each live up to them, and the other knowing that might be a support in that, or certainly not a detriment to that, because each person establishing their own esteem is going to be the best way that they can come together then as a couple that's each of whom is whole and complete, so they can create something new together. And now I know this is not a perfect formula, and you know this way better working with couples. We each have something or some things that we need to grow more of. Now, when we come together with a partner, that partner also has some things that they can grow more of. We all do. That's the scientific term called being human. So what we do then is to be a catalyst for the other to grow and to grow ourselves and to keep the two distinct. What happens with codependency is where one begins to function for the other and do for the other what they need to grow more of, which thwarts that growth.
Right.
So this is a model of two whole people coming together and growing, and that's where intimacy comes from. But it begins with the self of each of the two people.
That is great. And I think you wanted to ask one more question, if some brain hacks to step into
which you've given us many already, but what are some more brain hacks when you feel irritated with your partner that you could share with our listeners? What are some more you could share?
Like if you I know one of them, you said not to approach the conversation when you're in a negative mindset, but what happens if you find yourself in the midst of it? You don't have that presence of mind. What are some?
Well, that's where you have to call a timeout.
Okay.
You need to strike while the iron's cold, and in a different way. Here's what I would suggest. There is a free webinar that really answers this question in 35 minutes or less on the homepage of MentorPath, www.mentorpath.com. And it's simply called Master States of Mind. And there is a way of addressing this. There's a brain hack called the neural conditioning chart, how you outline. There's a story of the initial person with whom I hatched this idea and then how I've evolved it, because it's a micro system. We talked about if you want to change something, develop a system. This is a micro system that begins with an emotional trigger, recognizing what that is, and identifying the altered state that it immediately, instantly boots up so that you can cue your radar to recognize that as quickly as possible. Then to get grounded and centered and have an ideal behavior for each of the emotional triggers, have an ideal behavior pre-planned. And there's a sequence about how to do this and an illustration on that webinar. And it's a free webinar. I would recommend it as an answer to that question.
Nice. I like this. And I like the pre-planning. I think I know that I personally, whenever I've gone into a conversation where and as you know, we are Myers-Briggs certified, so we take that into account before we enter into any kind of communication that's meant to be productive with our clients. But I like the pre-planning, and we do that. We envision how we want this to turn out, and in a positive way that, and I, our listeners can know this, is that Jeff and I are just about certified to become Florida family law mediators. And so as mediators, as you know, you have to be neutral and unbiased and impartial. And it's a very freeing thing to go into that no judgment zone and not have any skin in the game. It's a very freeing thing. And we've actually used that in, with talking with colleagues, friends, family members, each other. We've used that kind of mindset to still be present, but detach emotionally, so that the outcome can be productive for both parties, for both of us.
Exactly. I'm sorry to interrupt. I have a commitment at the top of the hour, and
Okay.
No, that's great. That's it. You've been fabulous, Dave. Tell us how people can reach you, emails, etc.
Oh, if there are any questions or things we didn't cover, my email is dkruger, DKRUEGER, @mentorpath.com, or you can just go to the website, and there's a way to directly send me an email from that site. So I'll be happy to answer any questions.
And you also said you could send a discount coupon to anybody for your new book.
I have the flyer and a 30% discount on the book that was just released. I'll be happy to fire that off to you. Thank you so much, Jeff and Poppy. I totally enjoyed it. As I always do with you guys. It's a privilege.
Great being with you, and thank you for being part of our relationship restaurant.
The art and neuroscience of relationships. Thanks, Dave Kruger.
See you guys.
Bye.